In a single day, Napoleon Bonaparte lost everything. An empire that had dominated Europe for over a decade collapsed in less than 9 hours of fighting. June 18, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo. Roughly 47,000 men were killed or wounded across both sides before the sun went down. And the man who had survived dozens of campaigns, who had conquered nations and rewritten the map of Europe, made a series of decisions on that one day that he could never take back. In the next several minutes, you will walk through exactly how Waterloo unfolded, why Napoleon's army failed when it should have had every advantage, and what the single most consequential mistake of the entire battle actually was. Most accounts focus on Wellington's defense or the arrival of the Prussians. But there is a deeper story here, one involving timing, illness, subordinates who failed at critical moments, and a fundamental miscalculation that set everything in motion before the first shot was even fired. Stay with this because the truth is more complicated than the simple story of Napoleon meeting his match. To understand Waterloo, you have to understand the strategic situation Napoleon was walking into. After his exile to Elba and his dramatic return to France in March 1815, Napoleon knew he was facing a coalition of European powers that would not stop until he was removed permanently. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were all mobilizing. He had roughly 280,000 men at his disposal, but the coalition could field over 700,000. His only viable strategy was to strike fast, hit the Allied armies before they could combine their full strength, and knock them out one at a time. That meant attacking in Belgium, where Wellington commanded an Anglo-Allied force and Field Marshal Blücher commanded a Prussian army. Defeat them separately before they united, and Napoleon might be able to negotiate from a position of strength. It was an aggressive plan, but it was not an unreasonable one. It had worked for Napoleon before, many times. The campaign opened promisingly. On June 16, 2 days before Waterloo, Napoleon's forces clashed with the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny. The French won. Blücher's army was beaten and forced to retreat. Simultaneously, Marshal Ney engaged Wellington's forces at Quatre Bras, though that fight ended inconclusively. Napoleon had separated the two Allied armies, exactly as planned. Everything depended on what happened next. And this is where the campaign began to unravel. After Ligny, Napoleon assigned Marshal Grouchy roughly 33,000 men and ordered him to pursue the retreating Prussians and ensure they could not rejoin Wellington. This was a critical assignment, and Grouchy executed it poorly. He delayed his pursuit, moved slowly, and ultimately followed the Prussians in the wrong direction. By the time the Battle of Waterloo was underway, Grouchy and his 33,000 men were nowhere near the battlefield. They were chasing a phantom. Blücher, far from being neutralized, was marching his army directly toward Wellington's position to reinforce him. Napoleon had divided his forces, weakened his striking power, and failed to neutralize the very threat he had identified as the central danger to his plan. But here is what nobody talks about often enough. Napoleon himself may not have been operating at full capacity on June 18. Multiple historians and medical researchers have examined the evidence and concluded that Napoleon was likely suffering from hemorrhoids so severe that he could not mount his horse comfortably for much of the battle. There are also credible suggestions of a urinary tract infection and possible acromegaly affecting his cognitive sharpness. Whether illness was the decisive factor is debated. But what is documented is that Napoleon, who had historically commanded with speed and aggression, delayed the start of the battle at Waterloo until nearly midday. He waited for the ground to dry after overnight rain, which was a reasonable tactical consideration. But that delay cost him hours he could not afford. Wellington had chosen his defensive position on a ridge south of the village of Waterloo with exceptional skill. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean allowed him to shelter his infantry on the reverse slope, protecting them from French artillery. His flanks were anchored by fortified positions, the chateau of Hougoumont on the left, and the farmhouse of La Haye-Saint in the center. These strong points would become pivotal. The battle opened around 11:30 in the morning with a French assault on Hougoumont. This attack, intended as a diversionary feint to draw Wellington's attention, instead escalated into a massive engagement. Napoleon's brother Jerome Bonaparte commanded the assault and kept feeding men into it long after it had served its tactical purpose. Over the course of the day, around 14,000 French troops were committed to fighting over a single farmhouse complex that Wellington had garrisoned with roughly 3,500 men. Hougoumont never fell. The defenders held it to the last. And every French soldier thrown at that chateau was a soldier not available for the main assault. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon ordered a massive artillery bombardment of Wellington Centre, followed by a large infantry assault led by Marshal Ney. But Wellington's reverse slope tactic worked precisely as intended. French artillery shells that would have cut down infantry positioned on the forward slope instead overshot or buried themselves in the earth behind the ridge. When the French infantry crested the ridge, they met formed British squares and disciplined musket fire. The first major assault was repulsed. Then came one of the most controversial decisions of the entire battle. Ney, believing he saw signs of British retreat, ordered a massive cavalry charge without adequate infantry support. Between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Ney launched wave after wave of French cavalry, perhaps as many as 9,000 horsemen, against Wellington's unbroken infantry squares. It was tactically disastrous. Infantry formed in square formation was nearly impervious to cavalry without artillery or infantry support to break the formation first. Ney had neither. The cavalry charges were magnificent and completely futile. Thousands of horses and men were exhausted and lost for no strategic gain. But here is the pivot point of the entire battle. At around 6 o'clock in the evening, French infantry finally captured La Haye-Sainte, the fortified farmhouse in Wellington Centre. With that position in French hands, Napoleon had a clear firing line directly into the weakest point of the Allied line. Wellington was nearly out of ammunition in his centre. The crisis was real. If Napoleon had a fresh infantry force to commit at that exact moment, the battle might have ended differently. He did not. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, was still intact. But Napoleon hesitated. And during that hesitation, the Prussians arrived. Blücher's forces had been marching toward the battle all day. By early evening, Prussian units began striking the French right flank in force. Napoleon now faced a two-front problem he could not solve. He had committed too many men to Hougoumont, lost thousands in the cavalry charges, and now faced a fresh army hitting his flank while Wellington's battered but unbroken line held his front. He finally committed the Imperial Guard in a last desperate assault around 7:30 in the evening. The Guard had never been defeated in battle. Their advance was supposed to shatter Wellington's line and turn the tide. But Wellington had shifted troops to meet them, and his infantry delivered a devastating volley at close range. The Imperial Guard broke and retreated. When the rest of the French army saw the Guard falling back, panic spread instantly. An army that had fought all day collapsed in minutes. Wellington ordered a general advance. Prussian cavalry pursued the fleeing French without mercy. By nightfall, Napoleon's army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. He had lost approximately 25,000 men killed and wounded, with another 8,000 captured. He fled the field and abdicated for the second and final time 4 days later. This time, the coalition sent him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic from which there was no return. He died there in 1821. What Waterloo teaches is that no military advantage is permanent. Napoleon held initiative, experience, and a genuine strategic window at the start of the campaign. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to War History for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.